Hello, my name is Bruce Compas, and I'm a professor of psychology and pediatrics at Vanderbilt University in Nashville, Tennessee. And I am pleased to be a part of the HD Reach, Your Road to Wellness and Resilience meeting. To be fully honest, this is my first Zoom meeting presentation where I'm recording myself. This is, I think, my fourth try to see if I can get this thing to work and make it right. So hopefully we'll get through this and sail through smoothly. So I'm pleased to be here. I'm sad that we can't all be together in person, but I'm glad to be able to contribute from a distance. So the title of my talk today is Families Coping with Illness, Implications for Huntington's Disease. I disclosed before any talks that the research I'm going to tell you about is supported by funds from the branches of the National Institutes of Health and by private foundations. My research team and I have been doing this work for a long time, several decades, and we have worked with families faced with a number of different kinds of physical illness and psychiatric problems. And that's included families in which a mom or a dad has cancer, families where a child has cancer, families struggling with with sickle cell disease, with hemophilia, with congenital heart disease. And most recently, we've shifted our focus to include families in which a parent has Huntington's disease. So in addition to making the list, at this point in the work that we do, Huntington's disease has headed to the top of the list. It's become the most compelling and most important part of the work that we do. It didn't take us long to understand that the challenges faced by families in which somebody has Huntington's are significant in terms of the stress that they're faced with. So, and simply put, we're all in on trying to understand and do things to help families faced with Huntington's disease. Throughout all the work that we've done, one thing that's been abundantly clear is that life isn't fair. Life's not a level playing field. Some families are faced with greater stress and more adversity than others, and families who struggle with chronic illnesses go on that list of more stress, more adversity than families who somehow have been spared those kinds of problems. Within that, there's huge variability. Some families faced with significant stress and adversity seem to maintain their health, mental health, physical health, and even seem to thrive. And those families we would refer to as resilient, whereas other families struggle more. They have a tougher go of it, and those families end up with more problems and struggle more, and we would say they're vulnerable. And a question that goes through all of the work that we do, no matter who we're working with, cancer, heart disease, et cetera, is how can we build resilience in those who seem to be vulnerable? When we do this, we go through a series of steps each time to be systematic, to collect information, to learn, let families teach us about what they're going through in order for us to use that information in a way that would be helpful. So the first thing we do is identify sources of stress for children and families faced with a particular problem, and I'll focus on what we've been learning from families faced with Huntington's disease. Then we identify psychological, neurocognitive, or brain processes, and interpersonal or communication processes that seem to characterize families who are resilient. Then we ask those same questions to identify what is it about psychological, neurocognitive, communication, interpersonal processes among those families that are more vulnerable. And we then develop programs to support vulnerable children and families and try to help build resilience in them. So as we've gone through all of our work, we've been asking ourselves what's similar in Huntington's to other groups of families that we've worked with, and what's different, what's unique about Huntington's. So before I tell you about some of the research, let me tell you some things that young adults and adolescents whose parents have Huntington's have shared with us. This was some of what I first learned when I started this work about a year and a half ago. And to be honest, it's what drew me in, and it's what's kept me here. So a couple of comments that seem to characterize the resilience part of it. Someone shared with us that it's changed the way we have to do things, but it's brought us closer together as a family. And that struck me because 20 years ago, when we did work where a mom or dad was diagnosed with cancer, most of those families said, we hate cancer, we hate that it's a part of our lives, but it did bring us together closer. And that seems to characterize some families in Huntington's. It pulls us together as we try to battle Huntington's. Another said, we still struggle deeply as a family, and I don't think I'll ever be able to say I had a happy childhood. Despite this, we're coming through this together as my mom's sickness begins to come to a close, and I'm grateful for the healing that I'm beginning to feel. Others, though, shared things about their vulnerability and the toll that Huntington's was taking on them and their families. One saying, currently, one of my biggest challenges is my mental health. I honestly don't know what to do about it. I can't afford a therapist, and I don't have anyone to talk to about all my stress and anxiety. My family is not someone I can openly share my feelings with. The second said the biggest challenge I face with HD is thinking about my future. I find myself going weeks in denial and blacking it out, and then weeks where it consumes me and I can't get out of bed. I envy just about anything and everyone that does not have this illness consuming their life. And last, and most difficult, I am nothing but terrified of HD. I live in fear that HD made me less than human to the rest of the world. I didn't want to have dreams or continue the things that I'm passionate about. I was so hopeless that by the time I was 15, I wanted to commit suicide. So those three individuals, to me, are the examples of how we want to help folks who are struggling with this experience with Huntington's to build resilience and get through this as strongly as they can. So what I'll tell you about as quickly as I can today is stress and how stress has different effects on mental health, direct effects on mental health and physical health. And we'll talk about the stress of Huntington's disease. That one of the ways it affects us, all of us, is that stress affects our brain development and our brain function. It has an impact on executive functions, which are complex thinking skills that develop in a particular part of our brain that I'll explain. And Huntington's, in fact, also affects those same brain regions that are adversely affected by stress, kind of a double hit. Executive function skills, complex thinking skills, are the very things we need to effectively cope with stress. So as stress increases, it has a nasty effect of making it harder to do the things that we need to cope with stress. In addition, we don't cope all by ourselves. A lot of effective coping involves support and communication with others, and I'll talk about that. And that caring for others and being cared for by others has benefits and it has costs. So when I care deeply for other people, I benefit from that. That has beneficial effects for me, but it also can come with a cost, particularly if I'm 14 or 15 and taking on responsibilities that might be things that are a better fit for somebody who is maybe 10 or 20 years older than I am. We take all that information then, lastly, and how all those processes can be improved through psychological and behavioral programs to try to build resilience. So starting with stress, it includes both things that happen and how we think about them. Someone may have said to you at some point, and I've certainly heard it said, that, well, stress is all in your head. It's all in how you think about it. And that's not true. Stress is both what happens in our lives and how we think about it. So some circumstances are almost universally stressful for everybody who goes through them. But many events, there's huge differences. Some people seem to take a big hit and other people seem to fare much better. And part of that is in how we think about the events that occur. And I'll talk to you about that. So stress is both what happens to us and how we think about it. Stress then comes in different sizes and shapes, and it ranges from traumatic events that are sudden, typically beyond normal limits, and hearing that day when you heard you were diagnosed with Huntington's disease can be experienced by folks as a highly traumatic experience. You can define the time, the place, literally down to the hour, who was there, who told me when I got the results of that diagnosis. Pretty overwhelming. There are other events that are big, but not quite as big as a traumatic event. So for many, parents going through divorce would be an example of a major life event, not necessarily traumatic, but nonetheless a major stressor in their lives. Minor events are smaller, and those are the kinds of things that someone might define as sort of the hassles and that characterize everyday life. No big deal. But it turns out that minor events are important. So arguments with others, some of the chronic recurring things that happen with having to go to medical appointments or take somebody that I'm taking care of to their medical appointments. Each time they happen, no big deal. They happen again and again and again, and they start to take a toll. In fact, chronic events, even when they're small, may take a bigger toll on us than the big events that happen less often. And then finally, chronic adversity is a different kind of stress. They're not necessarily events involved. It's conditions that we live under. Most powerful one I can think of is financial hardship and poverty, but also living with someone who has a chronic illness is an adversity, not necessarily events, but just a condition that doesn't seem to go away. So when we started this work, one of the things we had to do was try to identify sources of stress for Huntington's disease patients and their families. So for patients, stressors include beginning to have troubles with my thinking skills. So I know that I'm having trouble remembering things. I'm having problems making decisions, and I'm aware of that, and that's a source of stress for me. Accompanying that can often be a loss of work and independence. So I can't hold my job anymore because my physical and cognitive skills don't allow me to do that. And if I can't work, now I'm becoming more dependent on other people, less independent myself. Maybe I'm not able to drive anymore. That's a major stressor. Trouble managing my emotions. So for some folks with Huntington's, it gets harder and harder to manage anger and sadness and other emotions that occur. The physical symptoms, the motor symptoms, the chorea that characterizes Huntington's can be a major source of stress. And for some folks with Huntington's, their world starts to shrink as they become more impaired physically and more impaired and difficulties cognitively. The world gets smaller. They can't move around as much. They can't get around as much. They can't attend events that they used to. They lose contact with friends and loved ones, and the world gets smaller. For family members, it can include seeing the effects of HD on a parent or a spouse, a husband or a wife, and seeing that in another person is extraordinarily difficult and stressful. Increased responsibility to care for a family member with HD is something we learned early on was a source of stress for family members. It makes good sense, and I'm sure for many of you, you know what that's like. Fear that I might have HD or develop HD. So that's a pervasive concern among children of adolescent age, young adult age, offspring. Arguments or conflicts that arise within the family, and then struggling to make decisions about genetic testing. Do I want to be tested? Do I not want to be tested? Those are major decisions and struggles and significant sources of stress. So I mentioned that it comes in different shapes and sizes, and big events often then lead to chronic stress. So in this picture, you see how something hits the surface of the water and it ripples out. And that place where it hit, that's a big deal, but those ripples are the things we often need to pay attention to. So events happen that then lead to chronic stressors, smaller ones when they occur, but it's the chronicity and those ripples that emanate out that are important. So what does stress do? It has effects on physical health, but stress does not make you sick. Okay. Stress makes it more likely that other things will make you sick. So what happens is stress undermines the body's ability to ward off other kinds of things that are going to cause me physical illness. And that includes viruses, which is pretty current and topical right now, my body's ability to fight off a virus, and bacteria. So what happens is that stress alters our immune function in important ways that makes us more vulnerable to things that could make us sick. Stress is also the single most important factor in putting us at risk for mental health problems. If I had only one thing to choose that might lead to problems like depression and anxiety, the biggest predictor of those kinds of problems is stress. So it increases risk for stress, for depression, for anxiety, for post-traumatic stress disorder, eating disorders, substance use disorders, all of those. And through all of it, we know that the effects of stress differ from one person to the next. Under this are the physical responses to stress. And I want to mention them because if we're talking about a physical illness, Huntington's disease, we have to understand what stress is doing to us physically. Our bodies produce hormones when we respond to stress. So we have a picture on the left side of the slide there of one of the cascades that occurs in your body when you're stressed. And one of the things it does is produce a hormone. We produce a hormone called cortisol. And cortisol is both your friend and your enemy. I believe that would make it a frenemy. And cortisol benefits us in many ways and harms us in other ways. Our body produces cortisol in a natural pattern that's shown in the graph on the right, where it's highest in the morning when we wake up. Our body's producing high levels of cortisol. It slopes down during the day. It's sort of a bottom or a trough late in the day and in the evening. When we go to sleep, it slowly starts to rise so that it will peak again in the morning. What stress does then is takes those natural patterns, an example of which is on the top, which would be how we respond to a stressful event, which is a rise in cortisol. When we face something stressful, we go up, we peak, and then we come back down again. So there's a natural ebb and flow of hormones and physical responses within our body. However, when we're repeatedly stressed or if we're vulnerable to stress, the bottom two graphs are the ones that are most important to look at. So if I'm stressed and I produce a physical response that goes up, but doesn't come back down, see that long flat line on the top? Now I'm overproducing this hormone that if I produce it in the right amount, it's a good thing for me. If I overproduce it, it's a bad. Conversely, just to make it more complicated, if I don't respond at all, that's equally problematic. So the lower right-hand graph is what's called the blunted response. So all those patterns are going on within us physically, and you can basically chart the same things for emotional responses to stress as well. So that's in the background, that stress is affecting us biologically, it's affecting us psychologically. So let's take a look at the next piece in the puzzle that we're concerned with, which are cognitive and executive function skills, your complex thinking skills. So roughly, this is very roughly, we can think of two regions in the brain. One is stuff that's up in the front and on the cortex, on the surface of the brain, on the prefrontal cortex, and that's where those executive functions live. Complex thinking skills, our ability to solve problems, our ability to hold complicated information in our head. Down deeper inside the brain, not on the surface and not in the front, is the emotional part of the brain called the limbic system. And there are parts of the brain there that are essential for our survival and how we respond emotionally to the world around us, to people, and to stressful events. Those two parts of the brain, the executive region and the prefrontal cortex, and the emotion region, talk to each other. They're connected by neurons that allow the prefrontal region to kind of quiet down and calm down our emotions. At the same time, the emotion region talks to the cognitive part and tells us when we're in trouble or when something looks scary or threatening. What we know from science is that when we're under stress, certain regions, and I'm not going to go into these in detail, something called your amygdala, your hypothalamus, your hippocampus, and prefrontal cortex are all involved in our responses to stress and our ability to manage stress. And for individuals who are exposed to stress, either chronic or trauma, the emotion regions, the amygdala and the hypothalamus, are activated, and the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus are sort of reduced and taken offline. And that's a bad scenario. If the emotion part of your brain is running the show and the thoughtful, complex thinking part of your brain is not running the show, we can get ourselves into some trouble. So what we want to have happening in our brain, and this is based on research that won Eric Kandel, a physician, won him the Nobel Prize, was he showed us what happens in our brain in good conditions. And that's that when we learn and remember things, connections in our brain, neurons in our brain that have synapses, the neurons connect to each other, we grow more connections. So when you remember things and when you learn things, there's a change physically in your brain in which you grow more connections and grow more neurons. Conversely, when we're under stress, in some parts of the brain, more of that happens, and in important parts of the brain, less of that happens. So what stress does in our prefrontal cortex, that part responsible for complex cognitive thinking that we need to manage to solve problems, negotiate the world, regulate our feelings and our emotions, stress actually causes those connections to be reduced. It disconnects the neurons. So we're less efficient at communicating information, and that prefrontal part of our brain is less efficient. The cells don't die. They sort of retract and they pull away, and they're less effective. But at the same time, the connections between cells and the emotional part of our brain get stronger under stress. So it's revving up the emotion part and taking offline the part of our brain that we need to kind of control and manage those emotions. So what executive problems show up in HD, which are not just the problems due to stress, but due to the disease itself, is difficulty to engage in complex cognitive thinking skills. So it leads to increased emotional responses. This occurs slowly over time as the disease progresses, and those effects are made worse by the chronic stress of the disease. So Huntington's affects the prefrontal parts of our brain and makes our cognitive thinking skills less effective and less efficient. And at the same time that Huntington's is doing that, stress is doing the same thing. So those parts of our brain responsible for complex thinking are taking that kind of double hit that I was talking about. The importance of that is broad. That affects many parts of our lives, but one specific place that affects us is our ability to cope with and deal with stress. So again, stress is hitting us twice. The stress itself is problematic, and it's also tying our hands in terms of our ability to cope with it. So let's talk about how we cope with stress. The best guideline I can give you for coping with stress, turns out, we've done multiple studies for years to prove the serenity prayer. So grant me the serenity to accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the most important line in that is the wisdom to know the difference. When should I try to accept things because I can't change them? When should I be trying to change things because I can make things better? So certain coping skills that we can have in our toolbox of coping skills are most effective for managing uncontrollable stressors. Another set are going to be more effective for managing controllable stressors. Next slide. So we have a way of thinking about it, a model that we have, and we talk about three broad categories: primary control coping, secondary control coping, and disengagement coping. Primary control coping involves efforts to directly act on the source of stress or emotions, do something about it, change things, change the situation, or try to change directly how you feel. Secondary control coping involves efforts to adapt to sources of stress. I have to kind of fit in because I can't change things. I don't have the opportunity for control. And the last one, it turns out not to be so hot, is to disengage. So I try to orient away, and I'll give you some examples in the next slide of what those things look like. So primary control coping, best suitable for controllable stress. The perfect example is solving problems, changing situations, gathering information, acting on something that's stressful in your life to make it less stressful. Fix it if you can. For things that you can't fix, one example of that is accepting a problem. I just have to take things the way they are, or thinking about it in a different way, something that psychologists call cognitive reappraisal. That might involve finding meaning in a stressful situation, or trying to think about something that's in a way that makes it less difficult. Back to those examples I gave you right at the start, where someone had said, this has been really difficult for me and my family, but it has brought us closer together. That's a reappraisal. That's focusing on and finding meaning in something that makes it better. Examples of that disengagement coping are avoidance and denial. And although they're the favorite for a lot of us, me included, they don't work. They take us offline, they pull us away, they interfere with solving problems, they interfere with thinking about things in different ways, so that we might get some short-term relief from avoidance and denial, but they're not long-term solutions to problems, and they never are. So then how do we link together those complex executive functions and coping? A lot of the problems that we have in complex thinking and executive function then make it hard to cope with stress. One example is something called working memory. So working memory is an example of a complex thinking skill. It's an executive function skill, lives in your prefrontal cortex. An example, if I were to try to test that, is I want to give you something where you have to keep it in your short-term memory and do something with it. So I read you a string of numbers, 7, 2, 9, 4, 5, 3, 6. And a simple way to do that is tell me those numbers back. Just tell me them in the order I told you. But a working memory task is take those numbers and tell them back to me in the reverse order. So you have to hold them, think about them, and do something with them. And that's a complex cognitive thinking skill that's adversely affected by stress, and it turns out adversely affected by Huntington's disease. Why does it matter in terms of dealing with stress? It matters because one of the key coping skills, cognitive reappraisal, involves thinking about something, keeping it in my mind, and trying to think about it or manipulate it or think about it in a different way. So if I reappraise something in my life, I have to think about it. I can't avoid it, but I also have to change it. If the working memory skills are undermined, then those coping skills are undermined. In addition, though, I mentioned that coping is not a singular thing. I don't do it all by myself. It involves other people in my life. And so we need to look at interpersonal relationships and communication and support from other people. A poem by John Donne, written over 400 years ago, almost 400 years ago, sort of conveys this. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod, a piece of earth, is washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory, a large piece of land, as well as if the manner of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. We are all interconnected. We have been hearing for 2 months now, we are all in this together as we face the COVID-19 pandemic, and John Donne's poem from 400 years ago still rings true. We're connected to each other, we support one another, we depend on others for support, and we provide that support to each other. So we're connected in social networks, and here's an example of 2 social networks, some pink and some blue people. And those pink and blue people have people in their lives, and some of them are connected to many others, and some of them are isolated. So we see somebody in the upper left, a blue person, who's very cut off and isolated from others. There's only one connection for that person. We see others in the blue and the pink networks that are highly connected to each other. And we also see people who sit at the connection between different social networks. So you could think of the pink network as one family, the blue network as another. And having lots of people in your life and lots of connections is a good thing. Relationships are complicated. Sometimes they lead to conflict and difficulty, but the person in the upper left who's isolated and alone is at much greater risk for problems of mental health and physical health. So we get sick when we're isolated. In fact, one of the challenges with social distancing has been how to stay emotionally connected to people, even when we're physically disconnected, because if we're emotionally disconnected, we're in trouble. So a lot of ways to study that. One thing we do in our research is look at communication in families, particularly between parents and their children. Best way to do that is to observe people, record their conversations with each other, and then code the verbal and nonverbal behavior that they display. And from that, we learn how families talk about stress. And in particular, we're learning an enormous amount about how families effectively and ineffectively talk about HD. So how we communicate and how we support each other is crucial. Effective communication, particularly one part of it is looking at parents and how parents work with their kids. Effective parenting is characterized by warmth and structure, making sure that your children know that you love them and you care about them, supporting them, providing them an ear to come to listen to when that they have their troubles and their worries, but also providing structure, clear expectations, providing feedback on things that are good and bad. Being a good parent, an effective parent, providing warmth and structure gets harder when we're under stress, when we're depressed, when we lack resources, or we haven't had effective role models. And our task right now is understanding what is it that Huntington's disease does to make it hard to parent. Within all that, whether I'm a parent or a child of somebody who has a disease, there's caring for others that comes with costs and benefits. So caring for others is a motive in all of us. Altruism, doing things with compassion, caring for others for their sake. Parents care for their children, and children care for their parents, and they care about each other. But there's challenges, and we've seen a cost. We've seen children of parents with cancer. We looked at teenagers who were trying to take care of a mom or dad who was sick with leukemia or some other form of cancer, and it came at a cost. When you're 15, you're not necessarily prepared to take over the family and take on all those responsibilities, so it's tough. We've seen children whose parents suffer from depression try to take on those same levels of responsibility. And one that surprised us is we found children with cancer even try to take care of their parents. They feel, they see the pain that their disease has caused their parents, and they try to take care of them. And all of those are done with the right reasons and the right motives. They come with some benefits, but they also come with some costs. So quickly then, the interpersonal consequences of HD for families, or it can lead to greater loads of caretaking, can lead to a loss of the person who has the disease, what some psychologists want to call an ambiguous loss. That person's still there physically, but that's not the same person that you knew 5 years ago and 10 years ago. So they're physically present, but the person you know is different. There's a loss of other social relationships. Our worlds start to shrink as Huntington's advances and cripples us in certain ways and limits us. There's the pain of seeing somebody that we love decline. And for those who are the offspring, the children of parents with Huntington's, the worry that they'll go through that same process that they're seeing. So it's some themes just quickly from adolescents whose parents suffer from this: watching and waiting. So I'm sort of in the shadow of HD, waiting in that shadow, knowing that I'm at risk and not sure what the future holds to me. And being alone in the midst of others, so feeling isolated. Although there are people around me, I don't feel emotionally connected. That person who said earlier on, there's just no one here for me and my family that I can talk to. So interpersonal relationships and communication are crucial for our health and our emotional well-being, and those things can get disrupted pretty profoundly in Huntington's. Family life is hard, having to be like an adult as a child, so continuing those same kinds of themes. So how can we help? What is it that we're doing in our work at Vanderbilt University and in Nashville in collaboration with Dr. Clausen that we can move forward with this? So we're developing new programs, and we're in the early stages to try to do our best to help families facing Huntington's disease. We think we've got a few options in front of us. One is how to improve cognitive function. So I've said several times, executive functions are important for us in many ways, including how we manage stress. And there are things we can do to sustain, maintain, and improve our executive function. There are computer-based programs. Some people call them cognitive training programs, some call them mental fitness programs, but using your brain and practicing your brain almost as if it's a muscle can have some effects. It's pretty limited to the things you practice on the computer, but you can build your working memory skills, which I had talked about before, and problem-solving skills by practicing them. And then a surprising one, aerobic exercise has a beneficial effect on brain function. It builds those connections in your brain. And it's interesting that we're not quite sure of why that happens, but aerobic exercise and using your brain to solve complex kinds of problems are both things that are beneficial. In addition, we've developed programs to enhance parenting, coping skills, communication skills. We help parents be better parents. We help children how to cope. So the cognitive training piece I mentioned, you can do this as an online kind of training. There's a company called Lumosity, a company called CogMed. You spend time at the computer. They try to jazz them up and make them as much like games as possible. There are some benefits, not pervasive, but there are some focused benefits of those. And then the notion of teaching parenting skills and coping skills, my apologies for a typo on this slide that just caught my eye, and our work with parents with a history of depression. If a family has a history of depression, a mom or dad has depression, and you're a child in that family, your risk for depression jumps up about 4 to 5 times greater than if that wasn't a part of your family. It creates stress in family environments, stress that's recurrent, chronic, unpredictable, uncontrollable. And the best way to adapt to that is using acceptance, reappraisal, and sometimes distraction. So we took that information, developed a program for families where a mom or dad has depression to build more effective parenting, warmth, praise, spending quality time together, listening attentively, validating your children, and then structure. Clear expectations for your child and consequences, and managing your own emotions first and then attending to those of others. So we do that in our program for families with depression. Next slide. We also teach coping skills to the kids, how to use coping skills to adapt. And what we found through a program is when families either received our program or received another kind of information-based program but didn't build those skills. For those who went through the information-only condition in our study, over a 2-year period, almost 27% of children in those families had an episode of depression within those 2 years, compared with 13% of kids who went through our family-based program, helping children learn ways to cope, adolescents really learn how to cope, and parents learn those parenting skills. And that's provided a model for us when we think about how to begin to work and begin to support families with Huntington's disease. Is how do we help parents who have Huntington's disease? How do we help their partners to parent in those families? And how do we help adolescents, young adults, children learn the skills to be able to cope with the stress of Huntington's? So as we translate then, we want to look at how to identify exposure to chronic stress and adversity in families with Huntington's disease, how to identify ways to build resilience and ways to enhance it. And that's going to involve a host of different interventions, we think, over the next year or two. So we've begun this effort, and our first step is meeting with families, learning from families, from the resilient families, from the vulnerable families, to translate that. So my last thought that I want to share with you is that many times people who do research to describe problems and understand problems, and then, to be honest, they walk away. And we're in this to learn about, understand, and describe the adversities and stresses for families with Huntington's disease, but we're not going to walk away. Our goal is to then develop programs that we can first test at Vanderbilt and then disseminate out to the Huntington's community in our effort to follow through on what I said is a compelling thing for us, our commitment to making the lives of families with Huntington's disease at least a little bit better.